hoping that the meetup, the numbers on the meetup, true to meetup, as you said, I think that Cyber Dev Dojo, a lot of people sign up and then don't go. So hopefully we can get more of the momentum around and really engage the community. So thanks for being a start of it initially. But today we have Chris. So Chris was in the Air Force, as you heard earlier, jumped out and then with a few of the other AppCert guys actually, and now y'all have Infocyte. So thanks for coming, Chris.
Thanks. I'll be talking about assessing risk in a breach world. And what that really means is how do we assess risk when everyone's getting breached or everyone already is breached. And so we'll talk about how people are assessing risk right now and with the given paradigms of what's going on right now and every New York Times article that comes out, how do we actually start evaluating ourselves based on this concept that we might already be breached or we are going to be breached very soon. So the role of compromise assessment is going to be introduced. It's something that we as Infocyte enable. So our partners, people who buy our software, go out and assess companies. So that's really not our idea and our invention. It's just something that we enable other people to do. So just a little background. So I was part of a team in the Air Force. I did incident response. And we had, as we looked at all of our breaches and everything that had occurred, we did about 1,100 investigations a year. So we were always investigating different problems on the network. We had a very large network, 800,000 nodes. And one of the things that really struck us was that when we did find something in our network, the root cause analysis always showed it was actually there a while. And it was there maybe a month, maybe it was a week. Or it would take us way too long to actually respond to it after we get an alert. And so we started looking at the data and every breach that was happening in the news as well. There's always one stat I always look at is how long did it take them to actually discover that breach? If they were attacked in June, did it take them till December to detect them? And so we stood up what we call the enterprise hunt team. At the time, the U.S. military was doing a lot of hunting. Hunting is basically finding bad guys in your network. We set up the first enterprise hunt team. It was actually started out with just 4 people. The other 3 people are actually much smarter than me. And then they all got promoted because we did such a good job. And I stayed and I took over the team. So I grew up to about 28 people. Helped build the tool set, evaluated about 80 different technologies in the market to see how we could hunt better, and we ended up seeing that there was nobody doing what we were doing. So we came out and I was actually medically retired back in 2014, and I came out and created Infocyte specifically to build a tool set from the ground up that could do what we were doing, find breaches, and stop people from staying in these networks for so long. So how do we assess risk of breach right now? First, let's start with vulnerabilities. This is like the big thing that everyone's doing when they assess risk is looking for vulnerabilities. Why do they exist? Because everything we create has some intended design, and the hackers find out how to do what it actually can do. And so there's always these unintended features, which is something that device can do, but it wasn't designed to do, but the hacker finds out, and maybe that little feature that they found lets them execute whatever they want on that system. Now they have control of the system. And unfortunately, so long as we have limited resources and deadlines when we create these things, and in an ICS environment, the amount of time these things are built, put in place, and left there, some ICS environments run things from 1985, 1988, and they stay there. And they're running old versions of COBOL, things like that. So we're always going to have vulnerability. And so a lot of the risk assessment that takes place is finding these vulnerabilities, finding some mitigation for it. And so we have 3 assessments and 3 tests that organizations do to try to evaluate, am I in compliance with the rules that I need to be in compliance with? We'll do a compliance assessment. A compliance assessment basically says, if these are my umbrella group or the organization that regulates us, says I have to do X, Y, and Z, this is my check to make sure I have policies and procedures in place to go ahead and implement those things. A lot of it is, the compliance assessment's oftentimes a pen and paper checkboxes. Do you have X? Do you have Y? As part of a technical assessment, you might do a vulnerability assessment or a penetration test. And a vulnerability assessment is pretty much a scan of a network, usually the outside. Sometimes it's a evaluation of an application, but oftentimes it's a periodic scan of a network or a device to see, can this thing be hacked? Are there any unintended features that have been discovered since the last time it was patched? And if there is a patch available, is it on there? And so Basically, they're going to come out with a report that says these are the holes in your environment, these are the holes in your network, or these are the holes in the application that an attacker could use to attack that organization. And so oftentimes that report comes out and says, patch these things. The penetration test goes a little further. It does the same thing to an extent, except you're actually emulating an attacker, seeing how far you can get into that network to see what you can actually do with that vulnerability. So instead of just checking that it's vulnerable, you're actually using it and demonstrating how they can actually take control of this network. So those pretty much make up almost all of the IT risk assessments, some variation of these that people are doing today. But ultimately, we have a remediation choice. When we find a vulnerability, we always have to either fix it, we have to mitigate it by putting some kind of defensive measure in place. Maybe that's a firewall, maybe that's monitoring. We know it's vulnerable, someone could get in, but we're just going to monitor it to see if anybody does. Or we accept it because the fix outweighs, or the cost of the fix outweighs the risk that's actually presented. And oftentimes that is the route that a lot of ICS environments take, a lot of environments where there's not a whole lot of change, there's not a lot of refresh of equipment because this stuff stays there a long time, or they have service level agreements where the vendor doesn't allow such things. So oftentimes they're either trying to come up with some kind of mitigation that doesn't involve patching it, or just accepting that it's going to get hit. In an ICS environment, oftentimes you have this kind of two-pane thing, and this is a pretty simplistic drawing, obviously, but you generally have your corporate business network where you have your stuff. You have another network segmented with the production for your PLCs and your different controllers. And oh, by the way, I actually studied energy, so I know some of this stuff, but we have never actually assessed the left on this. We generally do, Infocyte generally does the corporate side, but the concepts can extend. What's happening today, though, is where a lot of these assessments used to take place here, and they would test this division and hope to God no one gets into this part. Now these are actually merging. So a lot of organizations are starting to take data from this side, either through billing, because of uptime, because they want to track it in the control center that's in one state, and they're monitoring 27 different locations. So now it's all connected to the internet, and there's this segmentation's not there. The original idea was that you could have an attacker try to hit this, and they're going to have to go through a couple different layers to get in. Nowadays, you get one of these, and they should be pretty easy to get in. So segmentation's one defensive measure, but a lot of times they put these in place, and they oftentimes will put defenses and controls at the entry and exit points. So we'll talk a little bit about defenses and how we actually stop things. Because we know we're penetration testing, we're vulnerability assessing these organizations, we're trying to see what are the holes, and oftentimes there always are holes, and even if there aren't, people are still getting in. What if we do, we happen to patch everything? You know, we button it all up, there's no more holes in my environment that I've found. Are we good? Obviously not. But the interesting thing here is that no matter what we do, even if we do patch every vulnerability, we're still going to be vulnerable. There's always a degree of vulnerability. There's always someone out there that can find a way in. And so what we do is we defend that network. We know it's going to be vulnerable, so we defend it, we monitor it. So in a current defensive landscape, we generally have some kind of defenses. So network security, whether that's firewalls and segmentation, which we talked about, intrusion detection systems, so if anybody comes in, we'll see those packets come in and we'll try to stop them. Maybe they have on their devices, we'll call it the endpoints, that could be any device. You'll have different technologies on there like antivirus. And so this is your typical defense. But unfortunately, most of these orgs, especially ICS, have looked at defense as a static control. This is a control. As long as I have deadbolts on the door, we should be good. But those doors are open, so the deadbolt doesn't work. So we have to monitor it, we have to look at it from an operational perspective too, because the attackers are agile, because they're trying to get in. And now we have motives to do so. We saw attacks that companies like Gerritz responded to, where they're attacking power plants in Ukraine. And you have a thinking enemy doing that. This is not just keeping animals out with a fence. I know in ICS environments, the squirrel is the biggest adversary, because he goes and blows up transformers. Weather is an adversary. You can stop weather with hardening. You can't stop an attacker who thinks with just hardening. So things are getting breached, people are getting in, and it is causing damage. In fact, it's so bad that these are just stats from various organizations, not just ICS, but automated security tools and simple static defenses are not finding everything. I think antivirus has been claimed over and over as about 40% effective. Even though they get 99% effectiveness in some of these tests, that's using old stuff. When you look at anything that comes out in the last 6 months, even the best defenses aren't detecting it. And so overall, about 44% detection rates with new attacks from real adversaries. And once they do get in, they stay there for a long time. And this is actually compounded in an ICS environment. Within some organizations, they want to get in, dump the database, and run. With Equifax, they were there for, I think it was 2 months. So 60 days of presence in that network, stealing information, going around the network, stealing everything they could. 2 months of that. We've seen organizations with credit cards and retailers, which are customers of ours. We have multiple retail customers. And their malware, and the people get in there, and they want to stay in there because they want to steal credit cards every time they're swiped. In an ICS environment, it's even worse than that, because there's nothing actually to steal usually, but they're waiting for something. They're waiting for some kind of political motive to make some kind of action. And so they want to maintain access to that network indefinitely so that when the general says, turn off the lights, they have access over to the place. Turn off the lights. So we think of these as like logic bombs. So a dwell time of 6 months on average for industry-wide organizations is actually compounded with an ICS environment because they want to hide in there. If they do find a way in, they want to maintain that access forever and then use it when they have a political motive. So security monitoring is a good step, but ultimately, this graph is something we created to show adversary sophistication over time, or just the distribution of the types of adversaries that might be going after an ICS environment. So if they're trying to attack, over time they're going to get more sophisticated against a static defense. So your static defenses, which are able to do X, will sooner or later no longer be able to stop these guys. Or they attack you, they get stopped, and they say, I need to get better because I want access to that thing. So they get better. And so overall, your accuracy and your ability to stop these things, sometimes with your defensive measures, aren't going to be able to stop everything. So you are in passive mode. So you can maybe detect it. They did get in, you detected it, and you try to get them out. You have to respond in that instance. But at some point, it's even going to outreach your detection. You didn't even detect the attack. They're in the unknown space. How do you even deal with that? And again, we don't control all the variables either. So this environment, like the picture we saw, has this nice segmentation, but you have so many things that you don't control now, like vendors. You have people with access to these networks that you don't have control of. You don't control the doors. So we're gonna get hit. So what does that problem leave us? Is networks always have a degree of vulnerability. Organizations are struggling to prevent these attacks and people from getting in their network. And the really skilled attackers can actually stay in there almost indefinitely. I think if you look at any incident response company like Mandiant, they can put out reports all the time where they show when they respond to an incident, the root cause goes back years. I think the longest breach they responded to was 8.5 years. And we were part of an organization which, we got in trouble if it didn't last that long. So you try to stay in these organizations if you want access to them. And so if you're going to be an attacker, that's your goal. So without determining the current state of compromise, what's in our network right now, we can't stop at the three assessments that we define. Your compliance, you're in compliance or you're not, you get in compliance. You have vulnerabilities, you're always going to be vulnerable. Even if you patch everything up, did someone use one of those vulnerabilities while it was vulnerable? You don't know with the type of assessments that we do today. You don't have that. So we have an incomplete picture of risk. And so that's really where the compromise assessment comes in. It's an assessment capability that can be deployed into an environment to find these kinds of things. And so if we define it, I call it a proactive survey of a network and its devices to detect threats that have evaded existing security controls. It's really an ability to say, what's in this network right now? What's running in it? Are there any logic bombs triggered to run in the future? Is there malware? Is there unauthorized access? Are there credentials being misused? That's the kind of signs that you might be looking for in a compromise assessment. It's not, are we vulnerable or what version is this software, but is this software even legitimately supposed to be in this network? And so the goal is to catch them before they do damage. Sometimes they are doing damage, and you want to stop them from continuing, or at least mitigate the amount of time they can stay in that network. And if you could do that, you really reduce the damage they can do. I think globally there's a group called, I forgot the organization's analyst firm, global analyst firm that put out data on breaches showing the amount of money it cost tracked to dwell time, how much time it took them to respond to that incident. If you can respond to the incident in less than 30 days, you drop a $3.5 million average cost in half. If you can do it within 1 week, I think it's 67% mitigation. Within 1 day, you find the breach within 1 day and you mitigate it, you drop it by 97%. So if you can respond quickly and find these things, you can actually reduce your costs a lot and the possibility that they do damage. A couple of the deliverables and outcomes. So there's actually two, and this is actually some learning that we did. Deliverable one is the obvious one. We want to report on any threat we found in that network, any unauthorized software. That may be backdoors, remote access tools, implants. That could be in volatile or non-volatile memory. There could be riskware, stuff that you wouldn't normally call a threat, but something that shouldn't be in there. Maybe compromised credentials. That's a little bit harder to find, but it is something you want to look for. And then an inventory of controlled items. Are there things that the admins use that in the wrong hands would be bad? If those are authorized, you want to have an accounting of them, so you want to do that as well. Deliverable 2 is because some organizations aren't breached right now, and that's actually true. You know, the pessimist security guy in me says everyone's breached, and we just don't know it. But the reality is we've done enough of these to know that there are organizations that aren't breached. A lot of times they always have riskware, someone's got a toolbar they downloaded. But I've seen organizations that are very, very clean, have a really good security posture. It is possible. And you're not always going to find a breach. So in this compromise assessment, especially if you're doing it iteratively on a regular basis, maybe on the same basis that vulnerability assessment is done, or having a team doing this continuously, which we call threat hunting. The deliverable 2 really adds the value in that we're going to assess how would we discover a breach in this organization if that team wasn't there or if I wasn't doing a compromise assessment. So if it's a third party doing it, they'll assess what the current ability to find the stuff they're looking for is. If it's abysmal, and we usually know because we're running into the same kind of segmentation problems when we do this assessment, and we know what software is running, so I know what antivirus you're using or what even coverage you have. And in some ICS environments, they don't even have full coverage of the software they need to defend themselves. So that is a review, and generally a little bit objective, a little bit subjective. So now we can deal with the unknown because we're going to monitor the network. We're going to put in our static controls, which is going to prevent the attacks from getting in the first place. For those that get past our static controls, we're going to monitor them through detection. And now what we didn't monitor, what we missed, we can periodically look at by hunting or doing a compromise assessment. And a compromise assessment might be a really intense time-bound hunt. Hunting, if you look it up online, it's a lot of people talking about it, but generally a security team might hunt continuously looking for things that they've missed. In a compromise assessment, it is an intense time-bound hunt where I'm looking, maybe I'm doing 2 weeks, assess everything in this environment, do it hardcore, or in an ICS environment, I might have a window of opportunity to do it. So NASA is actually one of our customers, and they have very specific rules on when they can access these networks. They might only have 4 hours. So they'll, for 4 hours there, look for everything they can. They might not touch everything, but they've got those windows. So I think it's a pretty good practice that might be acceptable. So this, we can get a little technical here if you want, but how would we do such a compromise assessment? There's a lot of ways to do detection. Where would we do it? Would we do it at the network side? Would we put some sensors in there and look at packets? Would we go to the endpoint? Would we look at devices? Maybe we'll be in the corporate network, Windows boxes. Do we have an ability to assess the state of PLCs and other controllers that run on Linux or some other Unix kind of operating system? That might be possible. So we want to basically select an approach that's appropriate not only for the environment, and ICS is a particular beast. For us, we've created a generalized approach, which can be modified, but that generalized approach really focuses on some things, and we'll talk about how we do that. We actually look at endpoint before we look at network, simply because if someone's already in the environment, they might not have a whole lot of traffic going in and out, or they're encrypted going out. So endpoints we've seen as being very, very, has a high efficacy. Also, do we look at behavior or state? Behavior. If I have an ability to monitor what's going on in this network, my visibility is going to dictate whether I can look at the behavior of an actor. If I don't have a whole lot of visibility, not a whole lot of logs, I'm not going to be able to do anything about the behavior. I can't look at how things are operating in this network. With state, I might check what's running on this thing. I might look at a PLC and just make sure that the image is the same. And so state is more of a forensics approach, more of an incident response approach of what is actually on the box, not a one-time snapshot. Also, you have two choices. Do I use the existing security tools in the environment, or do I bring my own? In almost every case, I recommend bringing your own because the tools that are in place missed whatever you're looking for. But you are bound by policy, and in ICS environments, they may not let you bring anything new. So you have to use whatever they have, and maybe you can provide some additional thoughts to how to detect these guys using existing tools. But generally, you want to bring your own because you want to be independent. So I'll bring that up. And the compromise assessment that's defined, this is to be extremely applicable and to do what we want to do with the compromise assessment has to really follow 4 things. If you don't bring your own tools, it's hard to do the 4th one, but we want to be effective, and at the basic level, you want to at least know how to find all the known stuff. Known malware. You may use a technique in ICS since it's fairly static of just looking, making sure everything that has what it needs, like a whitelisting approach, and then looking at the variances. But ultimately, you want to be able to find the stuff that might be in there. And then on the advanced level, find the stuff that nobody else can find. Maybe your antivirus won't find this stuff. You want to be able to do that. It needs to be fast. You can't go in and do a compromise assessment over 16 or 90 days. 3 or 4 years ago, we used to watch Mandiant do this. They would go in and install a bunch of sensors and wait 6 months, monitor the network, come out with a bill of health. Is it clean or is it not? 6 months, you might as well be just join the security team. You're not doing anything different. Affordable, you can't do 6 months and think it's going to be affordable. So we generally look at timing from a perspective that I want to do this iteratively, maybe quarterly, maybe monthly. If the average dwell time is 6 months and I do a compromise assessment monthly, I'm reducing that breach detection gap to 30 days. Affordable also, if we can do this quickly, part of it is selecting the approach of what we want to do. Yes, I know I want to go in and baseline the whole network and use a UBA tool and do all this weird stuff, but the cost and the time required to collect that kind of data to install that infrastructure would be prohibitive. So I want to use a methodology that doesn't prohibit me from going in, finding bad guys, and getting out within a week or 2. And then independence, this is where you bring your own tool set. If you can bring your own tool set, you're going to be independent of that stack. They are using McAfee and say they're just using a McAfee suite and it's endpoint and firewall. If you come in with a different suite, a different signature set, a different methodology of detection, you're going to find stuff that McAfee misses, inevitably. That's often where you're going to find them. Any questions on that? Cool. So this is actually used by quite a few organizations now. When we first started the company, like one company offered compromise assessments. Others called it different things, but they weren't very effective. But fast forward today, you Google this and you got 40 companies or so offering this on their line card. Not all of them do it because I've talked to all of them. Some of them don't know how to do it. So we develop software to specifically do the methodology that we've selected. So what kind of things do you want to look for? I'll get to kind of how we do it. But MITRE has a really good model. So if you're hunting for bad guys in that network and doing a compromise assessment, you're not installing software to look for attacks coming in. You are looking for attacks that already happened and now they're in that network. And so you want to follow MITRE's model. MITRE basically details if you draw a line right here, everything left the line is pre-breach or during the attack, where they're executing malware, delivering it, executing it. Now they're in the network on the right side. That's basically post-breach. You want to look for the behavior of an actor after they've breached the network and already installed their malware or already elevated their credentials or something. So they're going to do these kinds of things. They're going to maintain persistence somehow. They want to survive a reboot on one of your Windows boxes, they're going to have to be in the registry or something. With malware that hit Ukraine, I think it was like Petya was the last one, right? That hit Ukraine, and that one, it was actually a bootkit. So every time it installed itself in the bootloader. So that's just an example of something you might look for, is has the bootloader on those systems been modified. But you look for anything that's in there, maybe it's lateral movement, maybe it's evasions that they put in place, anti-forensics, they're injecting into memory, that's kind of weird, you want to look for that. So these are the things you would look for. Some of them are easier than others. Some of them you use networking technologies, and some of them you can use endpoint technologies to find. But ultimately you want to put together a strategy that can get a good enough cross-section that you might be able to find somebody that's in that network. This is a big model, so you go check out the website. You'll see a lot of different techniques that you can leverage. In practice, what are we seeing? So for hunting, and I'll get to kind of which ones work best in a compromise assessment. We've seen hunting being historical search on alert data. So in the top, this is fairly limited, but we've seen, hey, I've got a report that says a Ukrainian power plant was attacked with Petya. Then that would take that report with the indicators of what Petya looks like, and you go to your power plant in some other country and you look for Petya. So that's one way to do it. Your historical search against your own alert data, stuff that you've already collected, to see if you've seen it as well. Another way, a little more intensive, behavioral analysis. So if you're collecting event data, say you've got packet capture, say you're logging different things, you've got proxy logs, those things aren't generally going to tell you when you have a problem. But if you analyze them, you might be able to find some behaviors that indicate your breach. User behavior when someone steals a credential. What are the users in my environment doing? It's tough to do a proactive assessment, especially as a third party, because you don't know what's normal. Also, I don't recommend doing some of the behavioral and user behavior stuff in a compromise assessment if you're bringing your own tools, simply because you don't know what the normal behavior is, and if you try to baseline that environment, you're baselining in the bad guy. So it's a bad idea to do that. State analysis, this is what we do. So we're going to use forensics, we're going to use incident response techniques. What's running on these boxes? I'm going to collect the types of data that a forensics professional might take. Give me the process list. Give me, let's do volatile memory analysis. Let's do what's triggered to run. Let's analyze the registry. And so I want a full inventory of what's running, what's triggered to run, and any evidence of compromise that I might be able to find. And that could be as simple as the antivirus is disabled on that host. Why is that disabled? And I might look at that. So from those three things, we recommend state analysis being the approach that you take, especially in a time-constrained environment. If you've got a limited amount of time, you're doing an intensive search, and you want to bring your own tools, you've got to assume they're compromised, so you don't want to baseline. And you want to take a full capture of everything in that environment. Because if you're just doing event tracking and monitoring and using the monitoring tools, are your logs complete and are you logging everything? If they're hidden in some dark corner of that network waiting to execute, you may not have visibility on that if you're just relying on logs that have been collected. So you want to reach out and look at devices on that network. So state analysis does that. So this is my one pitch for Infocyte. This is how we do it. I'll give you one case study, a little bit about the product, and a little case study, and I can take questions about the compromise assessment, when we've done it, who's doing it, how we're doing it. But Infocyte, what we do is we create a piece of software that basically, we call it agentless, but it does have code that runs on each device. But we don't install on the workstation servers in the environment. What we do is, let's say you're a consultant doing ICS compromise assessment. Maybe you want to do a vulnerability assessment too. You might have your Nessus on your laptop. You're going to have Infocyte on the same laptop. You might use Nessus on the outside of the network and see what's vulnerable. You're going to use Infocyte on the inside of the network. And generally, if it's in like an Active Directory environment where you have SSH keys to Linux boxes, you're just going to put those credentials in, and it's going to do a credentialed access to all those devices. Look at those devices for a small period of time, collect the kind of data we want, what's running on it, what's triggered to run, any evidence of manipulation. Take that back and not make changes to the environment. As a compromise assessment, we don't necessarily, we want to do more than what's being currently done, but at the same time, we don't want to change the network that we're assessing. So we call it agentless simply because we don't change the network. All we do is run code for a very small period of time. We don't do pre-installations. All we do is say, give us a service account, let's scan the network, find out what we can find, compare that against every known reputation, threat intel, and we do server-side analysis that lets us use multiple different engines. So if you've got McAfee, I'm using 64 on the back end. Let's see them hide from that. So this is we also give an ability to drill down into things that we find. So if we do find something and we find an anomaly, maybe one antivirus sees it and nobody else does. What is that thing? Is it a false positive? We give you the ability to drill down, collect a sample of it off that endpoint or off that device, and say, what is this software? And we'll hit it in a sandbox and we'll do static analysis on it and let you do a little bit of analysis on it, and we'll score it for you. But you can even do your own if you have that skill set. So the idea is that you could go into an environment and quickly assess it, find out what's on all the devices in the network. We don't do anything on the network layer for the packets, because generally, I don't know how big your pipe is, but I've seen 10 gigabit links. I'm not dragging a cartload of equipment in to go do a compromise assessment. I bring a laptop. Second, even if I did that, the cost would go up and my ability to find somebody doesn't actually increase. Networking-based tools, finding someone who's already in my network is going to miss the encrypted stuff, and they may not be active during the period of the assessment. So networking tools have a very low return on investment, from our experience anyway. Sometimes it's all you can do in an ICS environment, though. You may be able to assess the corporate environment, but those PLCs and other controllers are not going to let you touch them. So maybe your only avenue is to monitor the network for a little while. That's a modification to our methodology, but it might be the only thing we can do. So just a case study. This one we actually had one of our interns do it. So he was 18 at the time. One of our Cyber Patriot kids that we brought into the company. He's now an employee. He's really, really sharp. But when he was doing this, we sent him out, went to a mass transit organization that ran buses, trains, things like that. And they wanted to understand what their current security posture was. They were actually making a presentation to DOT and DHS for additional funding for cybersecurity. And they said there are regional transportation organizations, which are public-private, and we need funding to defend those networks. Because if the trains or buses go down in New York, for instance, that's going to be a lot of lost money. And so they wanted to make a presentation, but they didn't have enough data of any metro organization actually being hit. They didn't have any data. How do I make a case if none of us have ever been breached? So let's check if we're breached. So they brought Infocyte in, and it took about 4 hours for our intern to find some stuff. So we deployed on that. He took a laptop with our software. He spent 2 days. The first day, he found about 5 different things in that environment. On their primary finance system, they had a rootkit that had been there for 3 years.
Oh.
They had 5 different other variants of malware. Some of it was adware. One of them was not Bitcoin miner. One was a botnet thing. It wasn't doing anything at the time. We didn't have any evidence of recent anything, but it was there, and it was beaconing. So we found 6 different variants of malware that was in this environment. And the first thing they said is, hey, little 18-year-old, that's cute, but McAfee says I'm clean. Sir, we've compared this against a lot of different sources, so it's not just Infocyte saying this, it's also Kaspersky and Symantec and all these other guys. The rootkit that you have on here, nobody found. But I can tell you just from analyzing it, this is what it does. Do you want that on your system? And so they were able to take that knowledge or that the breach. We helped them clean it up. Luckily, they didn't have any. They were monitoring, what was going on, but the rootkit on their primary finance system could have been a huge problem. I don't know what it did over 3 years, but maybe it was going to a single domain time. But oftentimes that happens. But ultimately, they said, this is going to help my organization, because I thought I was good with McAfee. I thought I was good at X. I keep beating up McAfee, but it's like any antivirus vendor. So we've done a lot of these. We've done ones where we found clean ones as well. We used to do mergers and acquisitions diligence for different organizations that bought other organizations. So if you're going to connect that network that you just bought, maybe you're an ICS environment, maybe you're a power plant or something, you buy another one and you want to connect that up to your network. Why not make sure it's clean before you do that? Compromise assessment is a good way to get a level of confidence in that network. With one of our M&A transactions, the cleanest environment I've ever seen, it was a wealth management firm that managed over $2 billion in assets. So you would expect them to be well protected just by the sheer volume of assets that they managed. Very small network, and actually the cleanest network I've ever seen. No adware, refresh their systems every 6 months. They had outsourced security, they were monitoring it. Just a really well-maintained network. We gave the networking team huge props for how they managed that network. And when we first, when I first got the report, like, I didn't find anything. What do you mean you didn't find anything? We always find something. Didn't find anything. So we went deeper and deeper and deeper because, does my software suck? We even deployed other tools just to see if we were broken. And yeah, sure enough, the only thing we did find, and this is a common in a compromise assessment, because you're enumerating what's running on this environment, we found a piece of software called SAZOP. SAZOP was absolutely clean across the board, no antivirus, on virus total, green across the board, everything's good. But SAZOP is a remote access tool. It allows you to access the network at a RAN root level. And we found connections from Bangladesh. And the network IT team said, yeah, whenever they have a service ticket, the service ticket gets serviced in Bangladesh. Well, so we told the acquirer that they have a service organization that connects from Bangladesh with root level access into a company that has $2 billion in assets. And they said that's not going to happen anymore, but it was authorized for that organization. So that's something that you can usually find in a compromise assessment too. You have a much better picture of what's in your environment, not just the bad stuff. So, yeah, that's it. Any questions, compromise assessments?
What about employing a third-party red team? Because I know you do compromise assessments, but sometimes even though the company might be clean, that doesn't mean they're necessarily aware of all their vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
So what does Infocyte do something like that, or are there companies that do that?
We don't. We sell our software to companies that do that. So oftentimes we'll have organizations that do incident response, vulnerability assessments, pen tests, red teaming, and then they can add the compromise assessment and hunting as a part of their service package. And what we recommend is that a full scope risk assessment is going to look for vulnerabilities, it's going to look for ways into this network, and it's also going to have a look at what's in the network to find out if it's already compromised. And if you can do all those things, you have a full scope risk assessment. And then you can have a set of things that says, you aren't breached, you've got some holes, you should patch it, or you've got some holes and there's somebody in your network right now, let's deal with that first, while we get the patches kind of rolling. So.
Have you seen instances of adversaries hunting you on the network, hunting your tool out? Yeah.
So not actively. Being agentless and ephemeral, we only survive on the endpoint for about 90 seconds when we're doing the scan and looking for the data. So unlike an antivirus or an EDR technology or some kind of other technology that might be sitting on my boxes all the time, they may be poking at that thing, seeing if they can bypass it. They don't know we're there because I came in with the laptop, I scanned the network, and I got out. So in a compromise assessment, it's not a surface area adder to your vulnerability. So that's been difficult. Now, nothing's static in this world. So there's people like Raphael Mudge with Cobalt Strike, who I had one too many beers with at Black Hat, and he decided to mitigate our memory scanning. So he came out with a version in April of this year that actually basically one for one, and even blogged about it and showed a talk that I gave on memory scanning, and says, we're going to bypass this guy. And so he put in some stuff that mitigated memory scanning and really hid himself in memory. And memory scanning is like our big intellectual property piece. And so we deployed a POC at a different organization in California, and they used Cobalt Strike against us, which is actually not allowed by his terms of service, but they used it to test our software. And they're like, you missed Cobalt Strike. What do you mean we missed Cobalt Strike? And we looked at it and we're like, holy crap. And I looked at his blog and he had released a version specifically targeting us. It's like a minute 350 on his April blog. But it was cool because Russ and I hadn't been excited in a while because we had just been working on the JavaScript and the UI. And we're like, oh my God, someone tried to get around us. So we actually came up with a really robust way of finding in-memory attacks that doesn't rely on everything being in the same place or the right place. So it's super robust now, and you can modify yourself in memory all you want, and you're still going to look weird to us. We're still going to collect it. We're still going to hammer it on the server side. And things like, just because I don't categorize you as bad, doesn't mean that piece of code should be in that environment, right? So in an ICS environment, that's actually a little bit easier because it's not always moving. It's fairly static. So when you see these rogue things that are out of place, it should be there. You've got memory injection and your security process in Windows, that's always bad. And yet, Russian rootkits and NSA leaks, you look at any of that stuff, they're all doing it. That's always bad 100% of the time. Who are you trying to hide from? Antivirus is what they're doing.
how do you deal with critical systems? So you talked a lot about financial, and they have systems too where any downtime's millions of dollars.
Yeah.
How do you do compromise assessments with the risk management of critical systems in mind?
So in our pre-scoping engagement kind of note, we give them a document that basically says, how big is your environment? List any networks or systems that are high sensitivity. I will take absolute care. I won't do anything intense. I won't do forensics on the box unless I tell you. And then totally off-limits systems. So I get a report back so I can scope my engagement to say, here's my networks I want to assess, here's the ones that are sensitive, and here's the ones that are off-limits. And oftentimes we say, well, how do you want to assess the things that are off-limits? You don't want me to touch the domain controller, the CEO's box, and the PLC controller. Well, that's where the hacker's probably going to go. So you may have to have another strategy for those off-limits systems. But oftentimes, like in banking world, I've been in one where they didn't let us touch what's called the SWIFT network. The SWIFT network does the payments between banks. But I said, can I assess the teller who logs into the SWIFT network? Yeah, you can, because that's actually where all the attacks take place. The teller who logs into the critical system. And in an ICS environment, if we go back to, is this applicable? Where's that? If I've got an engineering workstation and he says, don't touch the data acquisition server and don't touch the application server, these are off limits. Well, if I'm an attacker, a lot of times maybe these are hardened or something like that. But if I'm an attacker, the most obvious route to get in is actually through the business network, through an email. Now I've compromised one of these systems, and maybe he's got an engineering workstation and a business workstation on the same thing. Maybe it's the same box. Nowadays it probably is. So we got in through one of these boxes, and since he's an engineer, he can access that application server. He doesn't have malware that actually works on this old Unix box. So what he's going to do is he's just going to monitor how this guy gets access, open up a terminal in the background, the same way, put in the same the password because he stored the password when he was keylogging you. And now he accesses the data acquisition server and application server. He's not on these boxes, but he's accessing it. He's accessing it from here. So if you do compromise assessment of these boxes, you should be able to find it. That's actually the best way to go about it. And oftentimes it's those weird squirrely Unix systems that most hackers don't know how to attack them. I mean, I've only met one person who attacks mainframes, for instance. Who even knows how to do that? But you access a mainframe from one of these. So this is where you hack. Then you can just watch him access the mainframe and see what he does.
So, I mean, I've never seen or heard of this tool before, so this is all news to me. But do you guys...
The tool that you sell for a living?
Yeah, you know, whatever. So, I mean, do you guys like integrate with other tools, like, I don't know, like other SIMs like Splunk and Elasticsearch? Perhaps you do like integrations with syslog. And like, how does this play in tandem with other endpoint detection response tools?
Cool. So, when you're defending a network, generally you have network layer devices and you have monitoring of all these endpoints. So in a modern defensive network, and I wouldn't say too many ICS environments are there yet, unless you've seen some. But generally, in a modern defensive network, you generally are monitoring the gates, but these jokers are going to cloud stuff all the time. They're going to Dropbox, they're getting emails. They're going to get hit regardless of what you have right here. So the modern defense is you put something called an EDR technology, endpoint detection and response, and what it gives you is the visibility into all these devices. And they'll monitor the devices, and so all of that gets fed into a centralized store, we call a SIM, or a log management server, or Splunk, or whatever. So the idea is you have a team of people monitoring this network, and they may be monitoring the entry and exit points, and they're monitoring every device on the network to see if anything squirrely happens. Now, EDR doesn't actually increase our efficacy. We've seen that time and time again. They're incrementally better at detection, but ultimately, in any real-time environment, you have certain limits, and in real time, and this is not a shot-for-shot on, I'm not going to do a shot-for-shot on technology and efficacy. What I'll say is in a real-time environment, you want to monitor this network in such a way that you don't generate too many false positives. You don't want too much burden on your security team monitoring the network 24/7. So you generally have a very limited amount of time to make a determination if that's good or bad. And so if your alerts from all these devices are a couple thousand a day, you may look at 100 of them a day. And so in that time, something could get through, even if you're monitoring. And the more data you have, the bigger problem you have. And so hunters, as a kind of a philosophy, want to favor no false negatives, not no false positives. Because no false positives is going to keep me, from going insane. But a hunter wants to look for everything, so he's looking. So you want to do a periodic check of this network using a tool like Infocyte, actually going down and saying, verifying independently, is this thing breached or not? Because oftentimes what ends up happening is I've actually walked into some of these meetings where we try to sell our software to companies that just installed CrowdStrike, right? And they're like, well, I'm monitoring everything. I see everything. And I'm like, your problem is you see everything. So if your efficacy is still like 98% and you're generating X number of events a day, do you look at it all? The best thing is actually look at these devices, do a state analysis approach. I don't care if it's scripts or Infocyte. Just do something, look at it. If you find something weird and squirrely, go back on the events that your EDR produced, and now you can go and look at the behavior of that time frame, or that thing, or that one system. Because if you have thousands of devices talking to one central node and one monitoring team, you've got too much data. And if breaches last 6 months, one query for one hash on 6 months of data, it's actually going to take you all day. So I can't do a comprehensive compromise assessment on data alone. I have to do it on the device. So that's kind of where we come in. And so hunt teams oftentimes will do the behavioral analytics to see if I can find some behaviors in my event data. But they also do a state analysis approach where they actually look at the devices. And they may use scripts for that, but we offer a product to do it. There's not many products that do it. But every hunt team I've seen generally has scripts to aid what they're doing.
And as a note, I actually hunt, so I hunt full-time on the industrial side of the network. And so what's nice with what Chris is showing is, the business side, you can use a lot of the traditional hunt kind of tactics. And the truth is you can pull a lot over to that production network. Like those operator consoles and the engineering workstations, those are likely going to be, a lot of the vendors are now up to Windows 7 or 10, hopefully. Some of the other servers are hopefully patched Windows boxes, but it gets interesting when you get to the other side, but kind of the quantity and scope of data changes, but you have a lot less noise than you do generally on the business side, luckily.
Yeah, these guys are getting emails or going to websites. You get occasional engineer going to a website, but
Yeah.
it shouldn't happen. So
Your software, you wrote it, or did you get it from the software engineer for this idea? Or?
So our company, we have about 20 people.
Yeah.
We've got developers, we got your people. Russ Morris and I founded the company in 2014. We both came out of the offshore, the same organization Dan came out of. We had built the tool set the Air Force uses, but it's all command line and it's all script based. And then when we came out, we didn't get a cake and code with us. And we didn't want it anyway. We wanted to do a ground up. How would we reimagine what we're doing and make this easier to use? It doesn't take 6 months of training to figure out. And so we built our tool set specifically to deliver the same kind of capability that we were using. Also, the number one challenge we had in any of our hunts was going into a network that didn't have logs. Every time I did a response, every time I did a hunt, I went to a network that was unfamiliar to me, didn't have my tool set, or didn't have logs. I was almost always out of the luck. And the only thing I could do was use my scripts, which collect its own data. And what we discovered is if you try to just deploy an EDR product, which does recording and monitoring, well, if this breach has been here a while, I've just installed a camera in a store that's been ransacked already. Or I'm installing a camera on a front door and the guy's already in the closet. So how's that going to help me? And so monitoring tools are not the most effective way to do a compromise assessment. You want to take an inventory, and most monitoring tools don't do inventories. State analysis is an inventory of every system on that network.
Hunting's also a heavily human-driven process. A lot of people would argue you can't threat hunt and pull the human out, otherwise it's just detection.
Yeah. Rob and I fight about that a lot. So, from my perspective, so Rob works for, Rob's his boss, and He's a SANS instructor. There's a big debate in hunting right now, is that, and the debate really arrives from this stat right here. If 44% of threats are going undetected by our automated security tools, then we have to do beyond what the automated tool is doing to find them. That makes sense? Here's my perspective. They're only automating the attack detection. They're not automating the find software in that network. They're not automating the part of that. None of that automation that's being bypassed right now is looking for these things. So if I can make some automation that looks for these things and highlights to the hunter, I found some weird persistence mechanisms. I found some execution in memory that shouldn't be going on. Now I found them. So as long as I'm looking for somebody in that network, I think I'm hunting. Different people have definitional differences, but that's my position, is that a tool like Infocyte will do a lot of the collection for the persistence mechanisms, the execution, what's running, what's triggered to run, any evidence of manipulation that we think an actor might do to stay in that network. We want to collect all that, we want to analyze it, we want to reduce the noise and present to you a concise list of things to look at. In a large environment, that automation is essential. And if you don't have a skill set, the automation is the only thing you can do. So both of those tend to be true in some organizations.
I think that a lot of all the tools that are available on the platforms, I mean, there's a plethora of all of them. However, I still think that there's a great opportunity to teach people, in effect, to be human firewalls. You know, you still see a lot of these breaches occur because of a lack of patching. You know, networks are still being compromised because someone opened up an email, you know, with malware. You know, so I think that mindset from the top to the bottom still has to be hammered home, you know, to be a human firewall, you know. I
think it has to be said. I mean, when you look at budgets of security teams and they're like, well, how do I do more? How do I defend better? Sometimes that CISO goes up and asks for double his budget. And the reality is, if you ask anybody who knows what they're doing, they will say the things you need to implement to make yourself more secure are free. It's hygiene. It's education. It's, you know, just diligence on what you're already doing. And so what's cool about the compromise assessment, and I've seen this multiple times, is there'll be security teams, and I've talked to these guys, and they're in organizations that don't believe they need you. And I go, let's do a compromise assessment, and they'll believe you, and they'll need you. Because we're going to go look at the environment and see what their investment in you as what fruit it's getting.
Correct.
When we find that fruit in there, it's bad fruit. And
Absolutely.
suddenly they have a justification to say, oh, this is a problem.
Right.
And so we've actually gone into organizations. I've done our first few assessments, we actually told them it was going to be free unless we found something. If you find something, you're going to have the budget. If I don't find something, then you're doing a good job. I don't do that all the time, but it's effective in that you do a compromise assessment. And we've actually done campaigns where, simply because there's so many security technologies in the market, we've been reaching out to new CISOs, new security officers. We'll say, hey, you're just taking over this organization's security. How do you feel about it? Because I have no idea what I'm adopting. Would you like to check? Compromise assessment would be a good first step. What are you adopting?
Right.
And what do you need to do to get it to the next step?
Right.
A good baseline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our goal is to popularize the compromise assessment, get it to a point where we can define it, that people are doing it in a fashion that makes sense, and once it's actually defined, available, and affordable, and we do that by enabling partners to do that, then the regulators see that and say, maybe this should be a best practice. Maybe this should be mandatory. If I'm AIG or Travelers or something, I may mandate a compromise assessment before I insure them for breach. Right now, they give them a questionnaire that says, what are you doing for security? And then they cover them for the last 12 months. I've literally seen policies where they retroactively cover an organization.
Wow.
Retroactively cover an organization that they don't even know is already compromised.
Wow.
So that's the problem right now, is there's no pre-existing conditions check for those organizations. And mergers and acquisitions, this is a new thing. We've been doing a couple of them, but we're working with a company that does 300 of them a year, and they're right now trying to convince private equity firms to do them for every one of them. They've convinced a couple of them. But we can make it affordable, if we can make it effective, if we can kind of follow these, that should be something that really takes fire.
It's a challenge too with industrial environments, because there are quite a few companies that do this for the industrial spaces entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, mergers and acquisitions is huge when you're looking at companies buying, like, they're buying up power companies in a given state, and now they're connecting all of these industrial networks that some might actually be regulated under laws that have kept them at a pretty good baseline, and some of the other ones are just Wild West, and now they're plugging it into their major networks. It's pretty bad.
Yeah, it's ICS MDU.
Yeah.
It's like working in the government, sometimes the policies are your biggest problem, not the actual technical problem. And oftentimes with compromise assessment, that's what we run into, is you don't get to do everything you want to do, everything you need to do, because the policies are in place that don't allow you to do that. In financials, for instance, the software that manages trading is actually not owned by any of those organizations, like wealth management firms, banks even, or hedge funds. So they have systems, servers, with software that allows them to do trades, and it's under a service level agreement from a vendor, and that vendor says if you touch it, your SLA is gone. So this thing sits there unpatched, doing high frequency trades, and they have an SLA that says they can't look at it. It's bad. In an ICS environment, I think you got the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, you can't just shut down production when a patch comes out a lot. Sometimes your only course of action is hunting or proactively watching for.
So interesting. So we were talking about what are people doing in practice. So let's get to our map again. I've seen this in an ICS environment. So we talked to an organization called AECOM. AECOM is a gigantic engineering organization that does a lot of the building of these things. I talked to the team about how they check these things. You can't even scan these for vulnerabilities sometimes, because just throwing packets at them is gonna, the wind goes the wrong way and they go down, all of a sudden you lose power. So they don't even let them vulnerability test them. So I've seen them literally take a virtual image in a maintenance window. They got a 2-hour maintenance window. They'll take an image of the entire hard drive, load it up into a VM, and now they've got a copy of it, and they'll assess that thing. So that's one way to access. That is an intense process, but might be the only way.
And the other challenge is virtualization starting to push down. And so one of the major control system vendors, they'll build out a whole refinery or chemical plant in their cloud, in the vendor's cloud. They'll spec it all out, do all the engineering, and then they'll push it to a vSphere instance in the business network to allow the company to actually test on site. And then from there, they'll actually push vSphere, vSphere running in the production network that's backing up all of the HMI and everything there. And so, with that and with industrial Internet of Things, what that production network looks like and how hunting's going to look the next few years is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. So, thanks for coming, Chris.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you.